Alrighty, hello every folks, and welcome to a topic that I found pretty interesting from a topic that came up on the Reddit the other day, which is going to be about the AI in this game and why it does the things that it does. Because, look, the obvious comparison is to the absolutely baller AI on paper that came out for FFT decades ago at this point. So why is it that in many ways the AI may seem like it's doing some pretty dumb things in this game, and where did kind of the root of all of this stuff come from? So first and foremost, we're going to have to go into some mechanics here, because one thing that has to be understood is that well, when it comes to Tactics Ogre, one of the things that I know I personally love it for, and a lot of folks love it for, is the kind of almost illusion that it creates around seeming simple. Because there's way the hell going on at every level of this game that in many cases it just never bothers to tell you about, never really brings up in any particular way. And again, a lot of these details are just the kinds of fun lunacy that we love to dive into. So for example, something that I specifically saw come up was like, well, why is it that the AI will target the things that it targets? Why can it not use debuffs? All of that kind of thing. When, again, back on the FFT side, you know, they had all of these different abilities that they were combining together, and they were able to figure out targeting just fine. So, let's get into some context here. First of all, in terms of the complexity of what's going on here, it has to be understood that the FFT system was basically two modes to every turn. You had your movement phase and you had your action phase. So basically your movement was just, do you incur a time penalty as to whether you've moved, and do you incur a time penalty as to whether you've taken an action? I believe it was about 10% of your turn time, something along those lines. For another thing, it actually had a sort of kind of turn system, and it was several rounds that were broken up into kind of priority order, and then essentially could be redone in different, not redone, but essentially the turn ended. Like, there was a turn for everybody, and then it moved on to the next one, and the next one, and the next one. And if somebody, you know, made an entire turn, like an entire loop, they could double turn somebody, but there were still kind of cutoffs for sanity purposes. So what has to be understood for the Tactics Ogre version of this is, well, a hell of a lot, quite frankly. So for one thing, instead of just movement, there's actually a penalty for every action that you take in a kind of deceptively detailed way. So for example, it's not just have you move during your turn. Every tile that you move on will essentially be increasing your recovery time cost. So at the start of your turn, you look over there in the top right, and it is a 0 RT thing right now. And if you were to move right here, it will currently still show 0 because this doesn't actively update in the UI, but essentially based on the movements that they take, they will be paying a cost for every tile moved. So for example, just simply taking a step over this way would incur almost no penalty, whereas taking a move over here would basically double that penalty. Now, this is actually, again, I see comments come up all the time like, oh, why are you taking shorter moves? You're just wasting your turn. Like, no. This is how you get your units to take fast turns. You don't use the time mage, you use efficient movement. So for example, like typically the average more or less is going to be 4 RT per turn, so you're thinking like 4, 8, 12, 16. This is why I was saying in previous videos that something like Swiftfoot on paper always seems better, but more than likely it is more of a kind of defensive action than it is an offensive one. So, for example, in many cases, somebody will, like, say, take a unit and just kind of directly charge them into the front, and then wonder why they didn't get a chance to respond. This is why, if you ever watch any of the challenge runs, in many cases, like I know through my videos and I know through others as well, we have a tendency to do those situations where you force the enemy to take their turn instead of taking a full movement up to the front. You want to create just sort of a gap before they end up approaching you. But the AI is considering this kinds of stuff in terms of their overall speed. The AI is an AI, so it's going to absolutely suck at planning anything. So instead, it's just like, okay, I want to save as much time as possible, I want to get in a better position as much as possible, and I want to do as much damage as possible. Now, the damage part is important, because they've had two different models of this in the past in terms of like how the AI will be calculating debuffs and things like that. Now, as far as I'm aware, nobody has an exact count of like how the AI is actually scoring this stuff, But the AI, believe it or not, at least to my theory, does not have anything to do with the fact that the AI is currently unable to use debuffs. Again, the recent patch basically confirmed that in my mind. We'll get to that in just a second. But in terms of like how the AI is thinking, what it's seeing is not like, if I move over here, I'll have, you know, better lines of sight over here and might be able to take a shot over in this direction, something like that. Calculating all of that might potentially be too much. What it essentially sees is, okay, I might be able to reach somebody that is like within my general range here. But what I would prefer to do is take an action and get into a better position. So, for example, if you've ever seen the AI do something like this, where it's like, okay, shoot and scoot, I don't care what I'm getting out of this, I'm getting into a better position. This is kind of the sort of self-preservation mode that some of them will go towards. Bear in mind, again, internally, all of these AI modes essentially have a sort of different criteria to the ones that you can give them, as far as I understand it. This is part of the reason that the Rogue apparently couldn't make it into this version, because they had, well, a mode that was kind of unusable by the AI itself, because presumably the traps were remade into the cards or something. Basically, it had stuff that others couldn't do, and I guess it was hard-coded because DLC stuff or something. I don't know. It's a little bit unclear. But either way, that was the reason why you can't use rogues in this version. Now, like, for example, what we have is attacker, defender, striker, mender, and, you know, this is having a small list of AIs has always been kind of standard in throughout the series, back since the SNES there. But what we're seeing in this particular case is that the AIs in question will typically have more of an entire kind of suite of different modes available to them. So if you, for example, ever taken a look at some of the spawns that they come with, especially in the PSP version, because it's less so in this one, a lot of times they will be stacked towards a particular stat. Early on in the game, a lot of these things have a tendency to overlap, so for example, sometimes they look like they're pretty friggin' piecemeal, but they'll usually, like, let's say, look through their equipment and be like, oh, you know, I'm a defender guy, I have to equip a lot of vitality equipment, so more than likely this guy right here was going for a defensive loadout, because you notice every one of his pieces of equipment has a vitality thing on there. So again, their equipment is going to be spawning separately from the unit itself. And again, in this case, this is one of those cases where it just kind of lines up, where they're specifically going for defense. Like, for example, with the archer here, you may notice that they seemingly cannot equip a leather vest or linen slops in order to get that dex bonus, but they are equipping the leather sleeves here to get dex bonuses off of this. Presumably, that's what they're going for here. And also in this case, they seem to be hard-coded to use one bow instead of bow and shield, which is normally what would spawn for them. Unclear as to the reason why. There's a few cases like this, but all of this stuff is basically spawning off of that internal AI kind of stuff. Again, the specifics will vary as far as all these things are concerned, but that's generally why we see a lot of the things that we do as far as that goes. So, for example, a particularly aggressive AI will more often than not find itself in a position like this, where, like, they're stuck in a choke point and they don't want to move anywhere, because they will aggressively attempt to charge forward. They'll attempt to hold ground in order to try and advance towards what it views as the center of your party, instead of, like, specifically going and, like, let's say, going after one particular person. This is again why in many cases it feels like they're deliberately trying to hold choke points, because they kind of accidentally are. Again, since it's an AI, since AI sucks at planning, in a lot of cases developers will have to go and kind of work around all of this stuff, especially for a game this complicated, which I've actually gotten a little bit off track here in terms of the stuff that the AI is actually thinking about, because we've only covered the fact that, like, for example, having different ranges and movement will cost different amounts of speed, but here's the other thing. It's also essentially looking for how much speed can I save while taking, again, as effective of an action as I currently can see in front of me. So, you may have potentially seen those cases where the AI will simply attempt to, like, let's say, punch or attempt to use a shield bash or something like that, and then run away. So, like, right here, basically what the AI would be seeing is like, okay, I've got one valid target over here, I'm going to do 1 damage, and I'm also taking a little bit of a penalty there because it's 91% accurate instead of 100%. This is going to be important later, And this is probably part of the reason that they raised accuracy across the board in this version. Not only to speed fights up, but to create a thing where maybe it's going to be a little bit smarter about its actions. See, back in the PSP version, there were those cases where it really penalized itself, depending on how much accuracy was there, and it actually was something that you could abuse to, for example, get Tartaros to not use his Apocalypse ability. Because, for example, you could create a case where, something like Rending Gale scaled off of accuracy in that one, whereas something like Apocalypse was more strength to TP based, and so you had those cases where if you managed to get your dodge high enough, he simply would decide, okay, this accuracy move is just going to be more worthwhile to me, I'm not going to use my super insta-kill move over here, that kind of stuff. Because, again, it was just seeing, its odds of hitting. Now, for example, again, the way the AI is seeing it, it has one valid target from where it can see right now. It's going to do one, but if I were to do one right here, I mean, it's not really counting the counterattack into effect, more than likely. But basically what they would see is like, okay, the RT on this punch is going to be less than shooting my longbow. So essentially they would punch and run away. Now, in this particular case, I'm just going to hide them over there because they're currently hit by fear, so their offense is complete doo-doo, but we're going to not even worry about that right now. Anyway, so again, that's kind of why they do the things that they do. Now, let's get into the debuff thing, because that's actually kind of interesting. See, recently, in patch 1.05, they actually changed something that has been around since launch. They went and they changed the Grimoire Exorcism into Holy Water. This doesn't seem like very much on paper, but let me explain. So there was kind of always this thought in the back of the head back when they originally had gone and put the game out there that, okay, maybe they just left it as Grimoire Exorcism, because realistically what people would do in the PSP version was that they would go and buy a bunch of scrolls and then just kind of go and use those instead of actually using an exorcist. So what they did for this version was essentially throw in a sort of, meta joke here, saying, oh, hey, look, the holy water bottle over here is called Grimoire Exorcism. They just turned it into a product. So you don't have to buy the scroll, you just buy the bottle. Now, recently they changed it into holy water, and that basically confirmed a theory that I had, that the reason that they couldn't use debuffs was because the debuffs and things like that essentially were remade from scrolls, that the spell system was potentially remade from scrolls. See, for context, I have been kind of going through the PSP version for well over a decade at this point. I've gone through that thing back to front over and over, a bunch of different modes, going through the One Vision mod, all of that kind of thing. I have experienced a lot of the weird quirks of that game in a very personal way. And basically the way that the spells are treated in this version very, very heavily implies to me that essentially they wanted to add this the spell system that was more reminiscent of the SNES version, because the PSP one was incredibly complicated in terms of how long your spell list could get. It resulted in the vast majority of spells never getting used, simply put, because people would end up using the scrolls or would end up going and that's a weird shot that he can't make. Fine. So like usually folks would just end up using scrolls for the expensive ones if they could replenish them, or would potentially end up going and just not using a lot of those abilities. So, for example, something like Brimstone was, in the eyes of challenge runners and such, a very powerful ability, but the vast majority of players never would have touched it because it's got low hit odds, and they couldn't convince people to use Spell Strike to save their lives, so screw it, just nobody would end up using it. Again, despite the fact that it was potentially one of the most powerful abilities in the game. Anyway, so through all of this, we kind of started noticing a thing that, again, that Grimoire Exorcism used to be the Grimoire Exorcism scroll. They just simply changed it into an item. Which makes me think that what ended up happening, again, with the spells is that they simply took the basic missile spells, left them as is, but then took those debuff spells and kind of made them out of the previous scrolls and such, which would potentially explain why the AI doesn't have a tie to those particular functions. A lot of stuff from this game is reworked from the PSP version, to the point where, again, a lot of the files are modified versions of those PSP files. So essentially, we are seeing a case where there's many things that may have potentially been kind of clever at the time that might have backfired, and that could potentially have been one of them. Because again, the more than likely these cards are a combination of taking the old passives. So, for example, stuff like Strengthen or Spell Strike or Clarity and things like that, and then or Spellcraft in the case of the Magic card. Because again, you could stack those skills 4 times. You can stack your cards 4 times. They are those same functions, even if the internal values of each of them have been reworked. They are still those same functions, taking what was presumably a hard-coded thing and reworking them into a field item that's just more fun to play around. Because realistically speaking, you could cheese the absolute hell out of that system, and to very comical effect, I might add. Because, for example, if you wanted Strengthen 4, you could simply take a Berserker, you could just run into Tynemouth Hill and then repeatedly train them up to the point that they got to 50, and then you can immediately reset to a different class, take their Strengthen 4 that they've earned along the way, reset their level back to 1, and then suddenly you got a guy that's easily able to one-shot everything on the map with no trouble whatsoever. So that system was fun to cheese, but not very fun to actively replay over and over. It took a long time to achieve. It wasn't very rewarding outside of kind of the grind paying off. And a lot of things about this game are basically saying hey, maybe we could chill on the grind. But in that particular case, again, they just kind of turned it into a field item. That way you have access to that stuff right away, just as if you had known that particular function. But it's something that the AI can do as well. So again, this is kind of circling back into the same thing, where I'm pretty sure they tried to do the same thing with these, just taking that same concept where you take a spell or something like that, you turn it into an item, and then suddenly, bing, bang, boom, you got this cool, clean, shiny, and colorful UI here. Which, yes, I do like not sorting this thing because it looks so frickin' colorful. But more than likely, because the AI could not use these debuffs or could not use scrolls back in the PSP version, they probably did something like the basic missile abilities and the heal abilities off of the basic magic types, and then just, let's say, went and threw all of these in from the scroll versions. The references to all of these likely would have been right next to each other, which, again, the last patch more or less confirms this stuff, because a lot of things within the game are referenced right next to each other in ways that, quite frankly, would easily be confusing. While it's not fair to call it spaghetti code, it's more a case of so I'm paraphrasing Rakes. He's the mod author of the One Vision mod, who has probably experienced this absolute wackiness more than anyone else at this point. But basically, in their case, when they regularly had those issues where they would change one thing and it would break something entirely different. There was one patch where, and I've already told the Griffin Gunblade story ad nauseum, but there was another patch where, for example, if there was something like a basic soldier using a throwing rock, it would crash the game because somehow the reference for that throwing rock got remixed into some different effect that no longer existed. It was something completely unrelated to them that caused this to happen. Now, bear in mind that this is, all of this is throughout the entire game, through its hundreds of hours of content, through its dozens of different classes, through all of its various weird script triggers and whatever else. Honestly, in any version, it's amazing it runs as well as it does, because, again, these are usually the kinds of stuff that you see a Bethesda situation on, where it's just hands in the air, we're out, whatever. If it runs mostly fine, we'll just let the modders fix it. In this case, I'm not even sure whether certain things technically have an answer. Apparently currently the whole Dark Knight weapon situation is because they tried to edit some other thing to, as I understand it, hopefully attempt to fix the shtick where the weapon profile determines your armor profile kind of thing. And as I understand it, that caused the Dark Knight weapons to suddenly unexist themselves. But again, it's because of kind of attempting to rework a lot of hard-coded stuff, because effectively they tried to, rework a lot of the systems as far as the PSP version goes, which had a lot of hard-coded things because, quite frankly, it was a beyond ginormous game that they tried to shove on a PSP, and it's frankly a wonder that, like, that thing was pretty much like bug-free in the very end of it. There were only 3, as far as I'm aware, bugs that you could ever recreate, only if you knew the exact right situations to recreate them. So it was very stable, but it wasn't necessarily very balanced because all of the work went into QA. In this case, they went into a project this huge with far less of a budget than they did last time, and honestly, it turned out pretty darn great. Like, I absolutely still love this version despite many of the flaws there, but we're getting a little off track here as far as the AI is concerned, because, again, it has more things to think about in this particular version. So I was talking earlier about the shield bashes, for example. So, like let's say they run up and they're like, okay, I can hit 2 guys with a spear, and it's basically calculating up, like, I can do damage on this guy, all well and good. If they're, for example, going and using like a sword finisher or something like that, which I don't have it on this particular save file, but, like, for example, they would count up both basic hits on the Rending Gale and probably add a secondary kind of value to the poison that they're getting off of Vile Wound. The elemental moves will boost themselves in terms of score. The multi-hitters are much weaker this time around to make the AI prefer them less, but we still notice that they use the debuff variants, because clearly they're still viewing some kind of value out of that, despite the fact that it may, in many cases, show a lower number. And if you want, you can still turn off the finishers that you don't want them using, because, again, you know, sometimes you just want to have the option to turn some things off, if that's kind of your thing at that given time. But anyway, so again, as far as how it goes, in the, like, back in FFT, its only consideration was, what move can I use right now? How much value can I get out of any of these debuffs? Who's immune to what? And what can I throw out where? It was a very, like, you could look down a chart and it would just be a few columns of like damage, debuffs, movement, good, right? In this particular case, again, because it's a Matsuno game, there has to be mechanics on mechanics on mechanics. It's not only considering the kind of speed, weight, because, again, based on the weight of your equipment, you're going to be slowed down by that. Based off the distance that you move, it's going to be calculating that. Based off of how much weight the weapon has in terms of swinging. So, for example, right here, recovery time goes up by 30 for swinging this. But at the same time, if it goes for a heal, it might potentially prefer to only spend 20 recovery time using the salve to heal instead. It's just kind of what it views as being better at any given time. And this is why they have a tendency to prefer finishers, because many of the finishers are dramatically cheaper in terms of speed. So, for example, Ruination over here would be a faster action than just swinging the weapon normally. That's actually one of those things that honestly, I never even realized myself until recently, that, yeah, many of the finishers do actually have a far quicker movement than the basic attack itself. Whereas, for example, in the case of something like a sword, again, 15 for its basic Rending Gale, but for the sword it would be 22. Anyway, so it's taking all of that into consideration. On top of that, one thing we didn't discuss was the actual tiles at play there. Namely, if we take a look over the tiles, we see that every one of them is going to have different properties to it if we look down there for the accuracy. Now, this won't always come up, but it will create those cases where, for example, the AI will generally prefer to stay out of water and swamp tiles because it'll give them lower accuracy. Oftentimes, stuff like agility has a tendency to kind of get thrown in the dumpster as like, oh, this is completely useless. But it's more or less an amphibious fighting skill at this point. So, for example, right here, there is a 35% accuracy bonus for melee and 40% for ranged when standing on this paved road, but it is 0 in the water tile. So essentially, this could cause their accuracy to drop to nothing, and whereas just standing on the grass over here, which is only 20, was enough to give a relatively accurate unit a 91% accuracy instead of 100, you can imagine what that would do if they were to go in the water. So the AI will generally consider that kind of stuff as well. But again, they do still have their limitations back from the PSP version. So for example, in PSP, because there were so many items, they generally worked around it that they would be allowed to use their healing items, they would be allowed to use offensive items, but they were not given the option to use buffs and debuffs from those items. Instead, those buffs and debuffs had to come from skills and stuff like that. So, for example, many of the auto skills in this case are allowing the AI to go and buff itself through different ways, or potentially use skills that it otherwise would have a hard time necessarily targeting. Whereas at the same time, we're essentially seeing a case where it's causing the player to also use some of those skills that they otherwise might not be able to figure out timing-wise, especially like pretty much anything Juggernaut or Hoplite related. Those had a tendency to pretty much never get used back in the PSP version, simply because, well, most players looked at them and they're like, well, low percent hit odds, I'm never going to try this. But you hide the hit odds, you make it automatic, you make it free, there you go, bing, bang, boom, you got yourself a solution to your stuff not getting used. Again, a lot of these changes, and I see comments come up all the time saying that it was, a very cynical cash grab kind of thing. This was an ultra budget project that you can tell they had good intentions. I know, again, in many cases, it seems like, deference to the director or whatever else. I think even at this point, and even in the community and whatever else, there's generally a kind of understanding that, like, the directors trying their best, they're definitely on the quirky side of things. Again, every Matsuno game will have this same kind of thing of, like, trying to throw in way too many mechanics at one time. Some consider it in an auteur sense, some consider it in a, just great intention sense. Personally, I consider it in terms of they're just having fun. Because, hell, a lot of these mechanics make challenge runs incredibly fun. That's what I'm here for. So, either way, that's just something to consider. So, again, as far as the AI is concerned, it has to consider every type of tile that it's moving into. It's been programmed in this version to understand choke points. It has to, so for example, it would place a higher priority on stuff like this, which in many cases I never actually realized until going through Reborn and kind of thinking about it. Many of the choke points actually do already have higher accuracy tiles in areas where they would want to hold things, so it's kind of an interesting one there. But again, it also has to consider the weather, because the weather affects things in different ways. So, for example, light rain or something like that would affect your archers a little bit. Something like a heavier rainstorm would affect everyone's accuracy except for wizards. Severely heavy weather, like for example some heavy snow, would dampen everyone's movement. Swamp tiles are especially difficult to navigate in that weather, but a lot of these little things are oftentimes not considered. So, either way, there's a lot to it is what I'm trying to get at. So if you ever seen, like, actually another one that's that tends to come up a lot in terms of, like, why would you go for one thing or another. I was mentioning this in the weeks leading up to release and all that, but for example, if you've ever seen a Berserker trigger their Berserk and then attack with their shield instead, that wasn't the AI being dumb, that was them saving their Berserk, because a shield counts as a piece of armor and essentially counts as an unarmed attack in some cases with a knockback to it, meaning that it does not trigger the activated skills that they have on hand. So essentially this means that a Berserker with, Berserk activated is taking a look at their options and they're like, okay, if I were to attack, like, let's say this was an enemy unit, I would hit my two friends here, or instead I could go for the lower damage and not cause damage to my team. But for example, say it's like, oh, if I were to attack right here, I might potentially injure my one unit, but I might kill off this enemy unit and I might damage this enemy unit. In that case, it would go for the Berserk. So what I want to kind of get across here is just, it's not that the AI is dumb. It's overworked, that's for sure, but there's a lot of mechanics. Quite frankly, there is no AI that would fully be able to account for all of this stuff. Because again, we're talking about an armor system, we're talking about a real-time movement system. The turns are not just turns, there's not like officially a kind of cutoff time for your turns. It's literally just a constant countdown that's going on. This is why, for example, in the SNES version, they had a problem wherein they had a stat that allowed you to boost speed. So, for example, back in the PSP version, the reason that speed became locked, became a locked recovery time score over here, and there was no way to affect speed aside from your equip weight, was because in that version they had a stat that affected speed, just like Final Fantasy Tactics did. And the problem was that you could essentially use the zombie status to reset somebody's level over and over and give them infinite speed. Or, for example, you have somebody train as a ninja throughout most of their career and then switch to anything else, and congratulations, you've got the Turbo Terror Knight and stuff like that. Like, the fact that you could abuse speed that hard in that version was a problem, which they tried to address in FFT by giving you a speed bonus every kind of certain few levels and things like that, but you could still abuse the hell out of it. So then for the next project in that particular line, they took a Tactics Ogre PSP. They're like, okay, we need to lock this down. Like, we need to make sure this shit can't move. So they put in that locked-in RT timer, and then allowed your weight to determine it from there. And they tried to balance crafted equipment with this RT timer by making it more heavy and things like that. But then it kind of led to this thing where the basic crafted equipment was still way too good because it wasn't heavy enough. But then the endgame equipment, in many cases, was so prohibitively heavy that in some cases you might just wear nothing at all in that slot just for the speed bonus. So instead, they reworked it again for Reborn. They're like, okay, fine, you know what, you get more slots this time, you get more to work with, the items themselves weigh a little bit less, and essentially the items themselves are giving you enough of a bonus that you never want to equip an empty slot anymore. But because all of those automatics and things like that are no longer adding to your recovery time score, apparently the little chirpies in the background are getting extra excited right now. Like, oh man, we're talking about equipment weight, hell yeah. But no, for example, in the case of this one, a lot of the auto system, for example, was due to a lot of player misunderstandings. And again, this is coming from a guy that has been explaining the PSP system to people for years and still constantly got like, oh, it should have been like this, that, other game, like every freaking video. So like, it's wrong because it's not FFT, or it's wrong because it's not friggin' Disgaea, or it's wrong because it didn't do this other random thing that's like Japan only, but you could only play it in Vietnamese, and how dare you not have played it yet. Again, stuff got real specific, but for example, like stuff like Meditate was basically seen as mandatory all the time, but folks would get annoyed because you'd have to switch classes, so it just became an automatic that all casters get in different ranks. And again, you would just previously be able to break that. In the case of stuff like Berserkers, they were always considered the strong guy, but since everybody can do the strong thing through cards, you know, they became the pincer guy, being able to pincer harder than anybody else. In the case of stuff like Lament of the Dead, it had a tendency to get left behind because, again, folks would look at the fact that you could rank it up. They wouldn't want to grind that up, so instead they would just throw it away. And, you know, stuff like Phalanx, which used to be very annoying, instead just became weaker early on, stronger later on, but is something that's more about just you can potentially disable it this time around. But one of those disabling methods would be, for example, to petrify somebody, which back in the PSP version would give them hyper armor, which would make them nigh invincible. In this version, because a lot of the damage numbers are kind of going up a bit higher, this has a tendency to mean that stuff like petrification is a bit more useful in an offensive sense, rather than just, you know, petrifying your own units to make them unkillable. Like, the thing is, with the AI and with everything else, I know we've kind of gotten away from the AI a little bit here, but a lot of this stuff is just, they clearly were aware of a lot of issues of previous versions of this game, of other games of a similar kind. I mean, a lot of the armor system, you know, spell availability, finishers, all of that, you have to realize it didn't just jump from FFT to this. They had Vagrant Story, where a lot of this stuff came from, and that was a basically 1v1 dungeon crawler in a lot of cases, so it had a tendency to get very complicated. And so when that PSP remake option came around, they're like, man, people have told us extensively how kick-ass this system in Vagrant Story was. They told us how much they like the, you know, the setting and stuff for Tactics Ogre. What if we, you know, it's kind of Reese's Peanut Butter Cup, that situation. Yeah, like, let's just make this happen. And again, there's a lot for the AI to potentially think about. And I don't think that the debuffs and buffs were turned off intentionally at this point. I'm pretty sure it was just a case of they were reworking those scrolls into something like this, and potentially, who knows, maybe somebody might be able to test that. Realistically, though, I have a feeling if the debuffs were working properly, like if it was an intentional just switch somebody turned off, again, we'll know as soon as anybody can actually access the AI, I'm sure. But if the switch was just turned off on him, more than likely it could have been a similar situation to what happened with the Japanese release. Now, almost nobody on the Western side would have played the Japanese version, so let me go ahead and give you a quick synopsis. Alright? Oh, by the way, that's a cute touch. I never realized that. She's got, well, that's weird. Her earrings are the Earth logo upside down, which I think is meant to look like the Wind logo. Anyway, sorry, they added a lot of details in Reborn that I just got to finally see on a way bigger screen, because higher resolution, because PC version. Anyway, so, okay. So, what was I getting at here? Alright, so, Japanese version, right. So here's the thing. The Japanese version of PSP was absolute insanity. The damage system was actually very similar to this one, where there was a kind of very big deference towards the offensive side of things, more than the defensive. However, this also created a funny situation where the AI was just kind of let loose with buffs and debuffs. They were just given access to absolutely everything. Which sounds like that would be the ideal way to kind of go about everything, right? It sounds like the perfect way to do it. And yet, despite this, any folks that had played both versions, by and large, would prefer the US release or the European release. Why is that? Well, it's not just the DLC, it was free in all regions, but, well, it was really frickin' annoying. Because back in the Japanese version, you have to understand, like, probably my favorite example of this was the Heim Castle fight. Namely, you have a bunch of units all over, just kind of all over the entire map, right? So let's go ahead and pretend this is Heim Castle here for a second. Again, I probably should have just done this on the Switch version until I'm all caught up on PSE, but whatever. So, like, let's say right here you've got all these guys over here, and we're going to pretend this archer over here is that warlock that shows up in Heim. Do you remember potentially some of the stuff that the warlock could do? So, you know, for example, like all of those weird buffs that don't come up that often, like Healcraft. Okay, so he's got those, like, in this case, like 9 dudes around him, right? So the AI was just let loose to do as many debuffs as they can. Their mind has been set free to do as many debuffs or buffs as they can, right? So, like in the Western release, when the AI was kind of coming at you, they would constantly bombard you with cheap debuffs, so stuff like Paralytic Wave and Poison and whatever else, and players got really annoyed by that because they didn't understand how Poison or how Paralytic Wave worked. Granted, they could have just explained how Paralytic Wave worked, but whatever. Again, Matsuno Project. But players got annoyed at the fact that they weren't taking turns, so they look at that and they're like, maybe let's chill out on the Paralytic Wave, so you mostly get it from ninjas and Cyclops. But then let's say you have this flip side over here in the Japanese release, and what's it doing? It's buffing everything. It's making the AI stronger with all of those buffs. But it doesn't necessarily understand what buff does what to what degree. It's just trying its best to buff everybody as much as it can. Again, something like, you know, you'd see in a lot of other RPGs, because all buffs are not oddly specific, because again, this is an ogre game. Stuff has to get oddly specific. It's just part of the charm. So like Healcraft, what does it do? It maxes out potential scaling for your healing abilities. What does that effectively mean? It's like, in that case, like 10-15 extra healing from, like, let's say a knight or something. Now, for knights, sure, cool, that's fine, it makes sense. They're, you know, they're very basic healers, so that extra heal scaling would make sense for them. Now imagine that it is doing this every single round on every single ninja that's around them, on every single archer that's around them, on, I don't think they have the Fusilier in that one, but like they're literally buffing units that can't even possibly benefit from the ability. They're going and giving spellcraft to berserkers. They're going and inflicting, like they're freaking out over the fact that, well, okay, the freaking out over debuffs thing has always been a thing in all versions. That's nothing. It's actually part of the reason that I mentioned that Eagle Eye plus a Boulder Bow plus 1 is kind of funny, because they'll gladly freak out and kind of skip a turn in order to get rid of, like let's say a silence on a basic soldier. It's like that guy can't even use that ability. What the hell? Anyway, point being, you don't want that either. It was really, really annoying. Again, this is coming from somebody that thought it was really cool at first. I thought it was like the definitive version at first. And oh boy, did that get really freaking annoying really dang fast. And you might be thinking, like, why can't they adjust it to make it act perfectly in all circumstances? You know, it's just a buff. Can't it understand the buff? Well, not really, because again, it's considering a lot of other things at the same time. Because if you tell it to, for example, start always using one particular thing under some certain circumstance, inevitably the private rule will come up. Again, kind of the old rule from militaries around the world, that it doesn't matter what you give a private, they will find some way to break it. That basically, somehow, some way, that AI will find a way to just completely break things using that particular rule that you just set up. Because again, this is a like 600 plus hour long game. If you want to go through all routes and experience all the stuff, it is a really long game. Something is going to completely snap somewhere, so it's better to err on the side of safety. So again, this is why a lot of those buffs and debuffs were made into automatics. Stuff like Howl over on your a Cyclops or something like that. Stuff like Fear over on your Terror Knights. Stuff like Eagle Eye over on your Archers. Like, a lot of these buffs were made into automatic passives while still kind of giving the illusion of them always being there on the basic wizards, you know, for you to use yourself. Because it's just, well, partially I think it's that transformation from scrolls into item slots, and then I think it just sort of became a sort of happy accident in which they didn't use debuffs anymore, and suddenly players were a lot less annoyed. Again, this version, I can tell you from having seen a lot of players play a lot of different versions throughout this entire series, this has gotten more players into this game than any other entry in the series so far, not only because of the new stuff that, not only the fact that it was on newer consoles, but the fact that it was more understandable, because again, so many folks played those original versions and all they knew how to use wizards for was basic offense, and so it kind of feels good, like, especially for new players, it feels good when the AI can only figure out how to do offense, and then suddenly you're like, oh shit, Poison Cloud is amazing. And then it's like, oh, you know, here, suddenly, you know, this move that the AI won't even use is way stronger than whatever the hell they're doing over there. It makes you feel like a genius. Whereas, for example, back in the PSP version, a lot of folks would get very intimidated by all of that, because it's like, okay, you know, a bunch of ghosts just rolled in and just curbs down my entire team. Those guys are twitching on the ground over there. Those guys don't have defense anymore. Those guys are just suffering from whatever the hell Bewitch is. I keep throwing rocks at them, and the super charm isn't going away, so I guess they're just mind-controlled forever now, and their loyalty sucks now. And, like, that guy over there is dying from some incurable friggin' brain rot that somebody's given them. I don't even know what the hell Spendthrift is or how that guy got it. But, like, you kind of see where I'm coming from with this, I hope. Where all versions of this came from clearly a genuine place of trying to make a solid strategic experience and whatever else. And, yeah, in Reborn's case, some stuff may have been set aside, but I still feel like overall, the general thing that they were going for, the general kind of strategy and kind of immersing people into this world and whatever else, I feel in that sense it succeeded. Is the AI perfect? No, and in many ways, yeah, it's going to seem like it's doing dumb stuff, but from somebody that has experienced every version of this AI from all different flavors of this game throughout the series, this is still the best that it's been, because it's always had limitations. From the heavy scripting of the SNES and PS1 and Saturn versions, to the fact that they had to take out the kind of constant time system entirely for Night of Lotus, from the fact that in the PSP version, it had a bunch of stuff that it straight up couldn't do. Like, for example, you know how you can put flying boots on in people for your units on this one? The AI could never activate their flying boots in the PSP version. They could not activate use items for the most part. There were some very minor exceptions, but for the most part, they couldn't use anything other than offensive spells on some castable items. When it came to any kind of like hovering buffs or whatever else, the PSP version, they just couldn't handle it because they didn't want players to, they didn't want their AI to accidentally burn out all of the uses on those items. So again, while not perfect, it does seem to do the job that it's intended to do. But all of it makes a lot more sense than it seems, you know, at first glance. I just kind of wanted to throw this video out there for context, to let you know that it's really not as simple as it is dumb or it is smart, but it does have a lot to think about. It's a machine with a lot on its mind, and realistically, I've never seen a like strategy kind of tactics RPG kind of situation where the AI has genuinely, outside of like direct scripting, which again is not really going to be too possible in a situation with so many freaking variables like this one, for it to intentionally like directly figure stuff out on its own. There's a lot of tricks in play to make it try and understand certain things. Again, debuffs being attached to autos or debuffs being attached to finishers, adding elemental variants to cause those different types of finishers to shine a lot more, because realistically nobody used Lightning Blade or anything like that back on the PSP version. Simply just some were stronger than others, and very few players figured out that they could augment their finishers. In this case, it's a lot more obvious. Back in the SNES version, you'd think it was more of a thing, but realistically it was like the equivalent of one augment rank to be that particular element, so this is the strongest that system's ever been. The whole weakness system seems like double stacking a verse, potentially, based on how it functions. But yeah. Anyway, so if you have any other questions on the AI and, you know, kind of how it does its thing, how certain things happened, I do plan to do other videos kind of going down why they changed certain things. I just kind of wanted to start with the AI because it was freshest in the mind here. And yeah, hope you all found this fun, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching. Take care.